I've been studying the Eastern Front for about 5 years now, and I know a lot of you watching have been looking into it for much longer than that, but honestly, it's something I can never get enough of. Every time I pick up a new book or read another account, I'm shocked all over again at just how brutal, unforgiving, and in many ways almost unbelievable this part of the war really was. That's why I wanted to make this video, bringing together everything I've learned and shaping it into one documentary that looks at the true reality of the Eastern Front, not just for the Germans, but also for the Soviets, who endured some of the harshest and most devastating conditions soldiers have ever faced. From the endless suffering, death, and misery, I've come to believe, even as a 24-year-old, that this front is still vastly underrated in our history, especially here in Western Europe. So much attention is placed on D-Day, Normandy, and the Pacific War, but the East was something else entirely. I'm also curious, when did you first learn about Stalingrad, or really anything about the Eastern Front? I always wonder what got people interested in this side of the war, because for me, every time I go deeper into it, I find there's just so much more to uncover. And honestly, that's what makes it so fascinating. There is still so much to cover in this theatre, countless stories, battles, and realities that don't get nearly enough attention, and that is why. It was the largest, most savage front of the Second World War, a battleground stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, swallowing entire armies in its endless plains and frozen forests. Here, millions of men met not in clean, set-piece battles, but in a grinding, unbroken struggle fought across wheat fields, marshes, and cities reduced to smoking skeletons. There was no respite, no law, and no mercy. From the opening barrage of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 to the last desperate shots in the ruins of Berlin, the Eastern Front became an open-air slaughterhouse where a soldier's life was as brief as a burst of machine gun fire, and where death came as often from cold, disease, and starvation as from the enemy's bullet. The enemy was everywhere, not just in the trench ahead, but above in the skies, in the tree lines, and crouched in every shell crater. For the German infantrymen, the war in the East was never truly about victory, it was about living through the next minute. This was not a campaign in the old sense, it was total war, a sustained descent into hell, and every man who survived left part of his soul buried in the red earth of Russia. For the men of Nordland, surrender was never an option. Captured soldiers often faced unthinkable cruelty. What their comrades later discovered was haunting. Many showed signs of severe mistreatment, with injuries too disturbing to detail here. This is one of the bodies they found, but due to the graphic nature, I've had to blur the image. In the summer of 1941, those same infantrymen stepped across the Soviet border with a confident stride. Their field-grey tunics were crisp, their bread bags full, their rifles clean and oiled. Many carried the combat rations and tobacco tins that Berlin had promised would last until Moscow. They had been told the Red Army was backward and poorly led, that the Bolshevik state was a brittle shell ready to crack. They believed the campaign would be over by autumn. In the Wehrmacht's grand design, the infantry was the backbone. After the panzer spearheads smashed the Soviet lines, it was the foot soldier who cleared the villages, rooted out snipers from the forests, and secured the river crossings. Many of these men had years of training behind them, or the confidence of recent victories in France, the Balkans, and Norway. They were well armed, well supplied, and certain of their command. The first weeks seemed to prove them right. In Army Group Center's sector, German columns advanced 30 to 50 kilometers a day. Villages fell without a fight. Tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers surrendered in confusion, herded into makeshift barbed wire pens. One Lanza wrote home that the war was a march through cornfields interrupted only by the burning of another village. In the north, Army Group North cut deep toward Leningrad. In the south, Army Group South encircled vast Soviet formations in the Ukraine. Morale was high, logistics still functioned, and every man believed in the machine they were part of. But that machine was not built to last forever. 4 years later, in 1945, those confident ranks no longer existed. What remained were fragments, understrength battalions scraped together from whatever the high command could find. Untrained teenage replacements, exhausted veterans pulled from hospital beds, men in their 50s reissued a rifle after years in civilian life. Instead of advancing, they were retreating. Instead of marching in step, they were stumbling west. Instead of storming across bridges, they were digging shallow, frozen foxholes and waiting to die in them. The front line was no longer a line at all, but a scattering of strong points, collapsing one by one. The difference was visible in every detail. In 1941, a German infantry company had trucks for its supplies, Luftwaffe cover overhead, regular rations of bread, meat and coffee, and ammunition to spare. In 1945, men trudged barefoot on bleeding feet, wrapped in rags, living on mouldy crusts or scavenged Soviet tinned meat. Ammunition was so short that many fired only when certain of a hit, stripping rifles from the dead to replace their own. Where once they carried spare boots and blankets, now they slept in their greatcoats until they rotted from their bodies. By 1945, rearming in the field meant stripping rifles from the dead and prying unexploded grenades from the frozen earth. The cold was the same as in 1941, but now there were no spare boots, no dry blankets, only rags wrapped around frostbitten feet. For the German infantrymen, the final battles of the Reich felt like a sentence passed without trial. In East Prussia, platoons were swallowed one after another by Soviet divisions 5 times their size. Orders were the same everywhere: hold to the last man. Most had no artillery, no radios, no hope of retreat. Isolated strongpoints clung on for hours or days until they were wiped out entirely. In the villages east of the Oder, trenches were hacked into frozen ground, littered with the bodies of civilians killed in the fighting. Farmhouses became makeshift forts, their windows choked with sandbags, defended by squads of 5 or 6 men. The fighting was short, savage, and often hand-to-hand. No one spoke of divisions anymore. The war was fought in scattered sections, often with no knowledge of where the next friendly position lay. There was no rotation, no rest, and no replacements. The Red Army came on with a level of coordination the Germans could no longer match. Each Soviet division backed by tanks, heavy artillery, and convoys of supplies. The German infantry fell back on foot, without vehicles or air support. In some sectors, the same exhausted group fought for weeks without leaving the line. In one Silesian village, a company of Heer's soldiers held out for 15 days, entirely cut off, burying their dead in shallow pits carved from the frozen ground. Not one of them survived. Morale in those last months was a mixture of fear and resignation. Most soldiers knew the war was lost. The propaganda, the victory speeches, the orders from a distant high command, none of it inspired belief anymore. But surrender was unthinkable. Stories of Red Army reprisals, rapes, mutilations, summary executions spread down the line. For many, to be taken alive meant a fate worse than death. The only choice was to hold on, even if it meant holding for just a few more hours. In Berlin, the infantry was reduced to scraps, fragments of battalions, scattered soldiers who had lost their units, teenage boys drafted into the Volkssturm, and veterans dragged back from the Eastern Front. Officers handed out Panzerfausts to boys who had never fired a weapon. They built barricades from rubble across the streets, fortified subway entrances and communication hubs. Every intersection became a killing ground, every window a firing point. The conditions were inhuman. Men slept in bombed-out shells of buildings, living off whatever they could scavenge. Ammunition was counted bullet by bullet. The Luftwaffe was gone. Artillery replied only sporadically. Soviet bombardments shook the city day and night. When Red Army assault troops crossed a street, they came with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and tanks in close support. The Germans met them with Karabiner 98K rifles, stick grenades, and the last working MG-42s. At the Reichstag, resistance was at its fiercest. Infantry squads were split into groups of 4 or 5 men per room, fighting floor by floor, staircase by staircase. There was no pause, only the endless rhythm of grenades, rifle fire, and screams echoing in the dust-filled air. On one side, the Soviets, determined to seize the symbolic heart of Hitler's Reich. On the other, filthy, wounded men whose only thought was to resist until they could resist no more. They fought with bayonets, knives, and even helmets as clubs. In some rooms, battles ended in eerie silence. Both soldiers, one Soviet and one German, lying dead within arm's reach, unnoticed by anyone else. It was a bitter contrast to 1941, when the same army had taken whole towns without firing a shot, as civilians fled and the enemy dissolved before them. Now, every meter had to be bought with blood. In the summer of 1941, as German columns pushed into the Soviet Union, the scenes they encountered varied wildly from town to town. In parts of Ukraine and Russia, many civilians met them without hostility, some even with relief. Soviet rule had been harsh, and in places where collectivization and political purges had scarred communities, the arrival of the Wehrmacht was seen by some as a reprieve. Orthodox churches reopened their doors for the first time in years, bells ringing again over town squares. Markets resumed trading under German supervision, and in Kharkov, hospitals and even dental clinics reopened under occupation, staffed in part by locals. In these areas, life, at least on the surface, carried on. Bread was baked, children played in courtyards, and farmers brought produce to sell, though always under the shadow of the war. But in many rural districts, there was little left to greet the invaders. Soviet forces, following a scorched earth policy, burned crops, destroyed railways, and evacuated livestock before withdrawing. Entire villages stood empty, their wells poisoned, their houses gutted by fire. For the Germans, this meant advancing through wasteland, and for the local civilians caught between the lines, it meant hunger, homelessness, and suspicion from both sides. The contrast to 1945 could not have been more brutal. By then, the German infantry was a patchwork of wrecks. The organized machine of 1941 had collapsed into scattered, understrength groups, fighting without coordination or plan. The front line was no longer a line at all. Resistance flared here and there, but without continuity. One street might be held to the last man, while the next was abandoned without a shot. Officers issued orders without maps or radios, unsure which units still lived and which had been wiped out. In small towns, the chaos was worse. Some detachments entered a village one day, only to discover by morning that the rest of the army had already retreated, leaving them isolated. Others fought Soviet units for hours, only to receive the order to withdraw with no vehicles, no horses, only their boots and whatever they could carry. Some tried to cross the Elbe in hopes of surrendering to the Americans, but many were intercepted by Soviet patrols. For those taken prisoner, survival was uncertain. Countless never returned. The few veterans who had survived since 1941 spoke quietly among themselves of the difference. They remembered Smolensk, Kiev, Minsk, marches in the sunshine, orderly convoys, clean uniforms, and well-fed men. Now they lay in flooded subway tunnels, relieving themselves in rusty cans, living on stolen bread, and wondering when it would end, if it ever would. That war had begun in a very different dawn. On 22nd June 1941, at 3:15 a.m., the sky along an 1,800-mile front erupted in muzzle flashes as the first German shells screamed across the border. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, Soviet positions came under a hurricane of fire. Over 3 million German soldiers, backed by nearly 1 million Axis allies, surged forward in Operation Barbarossa. For the Heer infantrymen, that dawn was the threshold into a war unlike any before. They had been promised an easy campaign against a disorganized, poorly armed enemy, a quick war of weeks, not years. Yet the Soviet Union was vast beyond imagining, its defenses deep and its soldiers, in some places, unyielding. The opening days were pure blitzkrieg. Panzer divisions cut deep into the frontier, encircling Soviet formations, while the infantry marched behind, securing villages, clearing forests, seizing bridges, and eliminating bypassed strong points. Companies were at full strength, each man knowing his role. MG-34 teams laying down fire, rifle squads advancing in bounds, sappers clearing roadblocks, interpreters handling captured civilians. The army moved with precision and confidence, but the Red Army did not break everywhere. In strong points, like the Brest fortress, Soviet defenders fought for days under constant bombardment. Along parts of the frontier, German troops met well-prepared bunkers, entrenched units that fought to the last man, and artillery that slowed the advance. The infantry, expecting to walk into empty towns, found themselves instead clearing houses room by room. trenches by trench, sometimes in open fields, sometimes in villages turned into improvised fortresses. Every meter began to cost blood. On June 24th, near Grodno, a German infantry company pushing through a belt of pine forest expected nothing more than scattered resistance. Instead, they ran headlong into a full Soviet battalion that had concealed anti-tank guns and heavy machine guns among the trees. What began as a simple mopping up operation became a 10-hour slugging match, with casualties mounting on both sides. Shell bursts tore apart the canopy, splintering trunks into deadly shards. Without the mobility of the panzers or the eyes of the Luftwaffe, the infantry had to inch forward alone, crawling from stump to stump under crossfire. In those early days, the common soldier still felt the adrenaline of victory and the confidence of being part of an invincible force. But the Eastern Front was already revealing its teeth. Marches stretched to 40 kilometers a day, under a sun that seemed to boil the air. The roadside was littered with unburied corpses, both human and animal, the stench clinging to every breath. Villages lay burned and empty, wells fouled, food stores destroyed. There was rarely enough drinking water. Some diary entries from the time described the Soviets as barbaric in their destruction, but others quietly admitted that this was not weakness. It was determination to deny the invader every scrap of advantage. The first major success came in the Battle of Minsk. In late June, German armoured thrusts closed a massive encirclement, trapping much of the Soviet Western Front. Over 300,000 Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner. For the infantry, this victory meant days of marching alongside endless columns of starving, dust-covered prisoners, guarding them past rows of the dead, clearing isolated pockets of resistance, and re-establishing supply routes across a country with almost no paved roads, no road signs, and infrastructure designed to break down under strain. Every bridge had to be rebuilt, every river crossed with improvised rafts or pontoons, every town searched for mines and booby traps. Even in defeat, the Red Army adapted quickly. By July, the nature of the fighting was shifting. Soviet ambushes grew frequent. Small detachments would strike at supply columns or isolated outposts and then vanish into the forests. The Germans now fought a war of nerves, constant patrols, night watches, and the knowledge that an unseen enemy could strike from anywhere. In the south, the resistance was fiercer still. Army Group South's infantry had to force the Dnieper River under heavy fire in operations that cost thousands of casualties. The crossing points were choked with the bodies of men and horses. The blazing summer sun beat down on shallow, hastily dug trenches. Supplies had to be dragged forward by horse-drawn wagons, and the mobile kitchens could no longer keep up with the front. The wounded lay for hours, sometimes days, waiting for evacuation. In many cases, they were left behind entirely when the advance moved on. By August, the infantrymen who had set out in June expecting a rapid march to Moscow was already worn down. Many could not understand how an enemy beaten again and again could still muster the will to resist. The propaganda bulletins insisted the Soviet state was collapsing, but reality at the front told a different story. Snipers still haunted the ruins of burned villages, ambushes still came from the cornfields, gunfire still cracked from the forests night after night. As the weeks dragged on, the front deepened and the supply lines stretched thin. Infantry companies were broken up to cover more ground. Replacements arrived younger, less trained, and poorly equipped. Boots wore out. Food came late, or not at all. Officers noted the steady slowing of the advance and the hard truth that Soviet resistance, far from evaporating, was being rebuilt. Yet the orders never changed. Keep advancing. There was no pause, and there was no retreat. German units received maps with blank spaces where roads and towns should be, orders full of over-ambitious objectives, and the simple instruction to keep moving forward. Any gap in the line was plugged with whoever could carry a rifle. If a platoon took casualties, the replacements might be clerks from divisional headquarters, drivers pulled from their trucks, or even cooks. By late 1941, infantry no longer meant trained riflemen. It meant whatever was left that could fight. And across the lines, the Red Army was beginning to draw strength not only from its own industrial base, but from far beyond its borders. Allied aid was already flowing in. Canadian wheat and tinned meat kept Soviet cities fed. American steel and machine tools rebuilt, destroyed factories. British intelligence reports on German movements were passed to Soviet commanders. Soon, Lend-Lease convoys from Britain and America would bring trucks, locomotives, aviation fuel, and radios, tightening the noose on German hopes for a quick victory. Then came the real enemy, the Russian winter. For the infantrymen of the Third Reich, the arrival of the cold was not just a change of season, it was a death sentence whispered in the wind. By November 1941, temperatures plunged below -20 degrees Celsius. The Red Army still stood in their path, but now the frost itself killed faster than bullets. The men who had marched across the border in light summer uniforms, convinced they would be home by Christmas, began to die by the hundreds without a shot being fired. At first, when the ground froze hard, the advance continued, but vehicles locked solid overnight, wheels fused to the earth, and Maybach engines froze in their blocks. Machine guns jammed with ice, rifle bolts had to be warmed by bare hands before firing, at the cost of flesh freezing and turning black in under a minute. Some men tried urinating on metal parts to thaw them, but the relief lasted only seconds. Sleep became treacherous. Soldiers huddled under a blanket in the trench might simply not wake up. Officers making their morning rounds found them frozen in firing positions, eyes open, rifles still gripped. Others woke with legs like stone, gangrene already creeping, amputation the only option if any doctor could be found. The cold was not a sensation, but a creeping numbness, feet, hands, then mind. Food arrived frozen solid. Bread was as hard as rock. Canned meat could not be opened without an axe. Water had to be melted over a fire, but wood was rare. Some tried to melt snow in a tin over a candle, producing a few sips of dirty, ash-stained liquid. Dysentery spread as men drank from polluted ditches. There were no medicines, often no doctors, and morphine was a rare luxury. Defensive positions froze with the earth. Trenches could not be dug. At best, shallow pits were scraped or ruined buildings were used as cover. Many burrowed into rubble, burning doors, furniture, even books for warmth. In open ground, 5 or 6 men crammed into dugouts covered with tarpaulins and packed with earth to hold in heat. The air inside was foul and damp, blankets sodden, the bodies of frozen comrades lying beside them until the ground softened enough to bury them. Offensives stalled. Winter warfare became static, deadly, and silent. No warning whistles of bullets, just the dull, dry thud of impact and bodies dropping into the snow. Sometimes nothing broke the stillness for hours except the crunch of boots on ice. Soviet snipers, dressed in white camouflage, nested in chimneys, treetops, or attic beams, waiting days for a target to move. One flash of metal, one careless movement, and the shot came without warning. The wounded rarely survived. Blood froze in seconds. A leg shattered by a mine turned black before help could arrive. Stretchers cracked and split in the cold. Uniforms soaked in snow froze into plates of ice. If replacements did not come, toes and fingers simply rotted and fell away. Corpses were stacked at the edge of positions to serve as windbreaks or bullet stops. Some were covered with branches, others left where they fell, frozen mid-motion. At night, rats and wild dogs fed on them. A sentry might pass the body of a friend killed a week before, unrecognizable beneath a crust of frost. Letters from home arrived sporadically, sometimes months late. The official news spoke of heroic resistance and a temporary winter, but the men knew better. Across the line, the Red Army thrived in the cold. White greatcoats, fur-lined boots, padded gloves, skis, and discipline. They attacked at dawn, in blizzards at night. They closed silently to grenade range or came in with flamethrowers and submachine guns. German units had little answer. Winter eroded discipline. Men who had followed every order in France now wept in their foxholes, refusing to leave. Some feigned illness, others simply stayed in their dugouts. Officers cracked down, arrests, punishments, even executions for desertion, but they could not restore the will to fight. The neat columns and clean uniforms of June had been replaced by bearded, frost-bitten men fighting hand-to-hand for scraps of food, for a cigarette, for a moment of warmth. Then came Stalingrad. On 23 August 1942, German artillery began a bombardment that shook the banks of the Volga for hours, flattening whole neighborhoods and setting the city ablaze. Oil tanks burst, coal heaps caught fire, and the river itself seemed to burn as slicks of fuel drifted downstream. The next morning, infantry from the 71st Division advanced through smoking ruins, stepping over charred bodies and picking their way through beams that glowed red with heat. In some streets, the way forward had to be hacked with bayonets through the remains of civilians who had been caught in the flames. From that day on, Stalingrad was no longer a battle. It was an inferno that devoured men and material block by block, room by room. At the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, German infantry assaulted machine gun nests concealed behind heaps of metal slag. Shards of hot iron sliced through uniforms like razors. Men rolling to avoid fire burned their palms on still glowing sheet metal. They advanced in pairs, using scaffolding planks as makeshift shields, only for 7.62 mm rounds to splinter the wood and drive splinters deep into their hands. Workshops became killing grounds. Platoons had to fight their way across oil-soaked floors, clamber over overturned lathes, and scan the beams above for Soviet snipers shifting position like cats among the rafters. The Red Army fought from every corner, every shadow, and for the Germans there was no way out but forward. While the streets of Stalingrad burned, another colossal struggle was tearing the heart out of the Eastern Front far to the north, the Battle of Rzhev. From the summer of 1942 through early 1943, this sector became known among Soviet troops as the Rzhev meat grinder. German and Soviet forces clashed in repeated offensives over marshy forests and small villages west of Moscow, trading ground measured in hundreds of meters at the cost of tens of thousands of lives. Entire Soviet divisions were fed into assaults that gained little more than a ruined hamlet or a stretch of trench, only to lose it days later in a German counterattack. For the men fighting at Stalingrad, the news from Rzhev was a grim reminder that the whole front was bleeding. There was no quiet sector, no relief. In Stalingrad itself, the Red Army clung to the west bank of the Volga by a thread. Reinforcements from the 62nd Army crossed the river at night, barges covered by smoke screens drifting through the icy current. Sometimes they slipped across unseen, other times they were caught in the glare of German searchlights and torn apart by artillery before they reached the shore. Those who made it ashore arrived soaked to the bone, dragging crates of ammunition and 50mm mortars that might last a single day. Many carried no rifles, waiting to pick one up from a fallen comrade. Commissars repeated the grim formula: 1 rifle, 2 men, and enforced it with Tokarev pistols aimed at the backs of those who faltered. The fight spilled underground and onto the rooftops. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat warfare. At street level, buildings were hollow shells. Life and death unfolded below, in broken foundations and sewer tunnels, where soldiers slept on crushed glass and breathed cement dust. At the Barricadi factory, the concrete columns had shattered, and each room became an island, Soviets in one corner, Germans in the next, separated only by a bullet-pocked wall. Steam pipes burst under bombardment, filling the air with boiling fog that blinded both sides. Men groped through the haze, recognizing friend from foe only by the sound of their voices, before plunging bayonets into the shapes before them. On Mamayev Kurgan, the hill above the city, the earth changed hands daily. At dawn, a German battalion might hold the crest. By dusk, a Soviet counterattack had taken it back. Craters overlapped until the ground was churned into a bloody soup. Sappers digging in under mortar fire unearthed bones, sometimes fresh, and shoveled them aside without pause. The Luftwaffe could no longer dominate the skies, and Soviet Iltus swept in low over the city, their cannon shells and rockets shattering Opel Blitz trucks carrying bread and rifle ammunition. With October came the cold, and the smell changed. The ruins took on a sickly sweet tang, the scent of human flesh mingling with wet plaster. Rats grew so large they were mistaken for cats and fed on the boots and blackened fingers of the wounded. At aid stations, exhausted doctors amputated limbs with dull saws, often without chloroform. Outside, Sturmovik attacks and Soviet artillery kept up an unbroken rhythm. Every blast shook the kerosene lamps, plunging surgery rooms into darkness until a shivering orderly held up a flashlight. Nights were filled with infiltration raids. German assault squads would smash into half-ruined houses, hurling stick grenades and firing MP-40s into the dust, only to discover the Soviets had cut a hole into the next building and slipped around to strike from behind. The Volga remained the fixed point. Soviet anti-aircraft guns, lacking aerial targets, fired horizontally from sandbagged platforms at German strongpoints. Tracer fire laced the night sky like the ribs of a burning animal. German 105mm howitzers answered, blasting swathes of frozen earth and shredding barges before they could beach. Hunger gnawed at both sides. German rations fell to 200 grams of bread a day, supplemented by tins of horse meat taken from the Romanian 6th Army's stores. The Soviets survived on raw flour mixed with shredded paper and broth boiled from leather belts. Sometimes, when a batch of biscuits reached the lines, the guns fell silent as Russians and Germans lunged for them alike, momentarily blind to uniforms. Disease followed. Dysentery and typhus crept through the German ranks. Paramedics tried to disinfect shallow latrines with chlorine, but the frost made deep pits impossible, leaving the filth exposed to freeze and thaw. By mid-November, General Paulus concentrated his efforts on the Krasny Oktyabr, the Red October steelworks, believing its capture could split the Soviet defenses. Pak-40 anti-tank guns in nearby blocks blasted the factory's walls to rubble, and the infantry surged forward under a shroud of dust. Inside, they found corridors barricaded with sheet metal stacked like steps, Soviet DP machine guns firing through narrow slits. Sappers hurled satchel charges that sent clouds of rust swirling through the air, only for soot-blackened defenders to reappear, fighting to the death on the same slabs they had held minutes before. In the tunnels below, humidity turned the bricks to slime. The Soviets strung electric cables through flooded galleries, rigging them to capture generators and electrifying the water until the Germans died, twitching in the dark. Flampanzer 41 teams answered with jets of fire that clung to the walls and sucked the oxygen from the air in seconds. The screams of the trapped turned animal before cutting off with a hiss. Winter closed in on both armies. Blizzards masked the smoke of artillery. Men from opposite sides stumbled into each other in ash-filled corridors, firing at point-blank range and stepping over the wounded without stopping. Batteries for flashlights ran out. Clocks stopped. Days and nights blurred into a single stretch of fire, frost, and the shrieking roar of Katyusha rockets. The overpressure from a salvo could burst lungs, shatter eardrums, and rupture eyes. Those who survived stumbled back to a dugout, were patched up and sent out again. The central railway station was nothing more than a jumble of wreckage, a heap of splintered girders and shattered stone that could change hands a dozen times in a single day. Wrecked locomotives lay on their sides, their hulks turned into bunkers, their twisted frames packed with jagged metal that sprayed shrapnel with every hit. Soviet riflemen crouched on the roofs of gutted wagons, firing down through the gaps. Germans burrowed beneath the iron bolts, using their helmets as makeshift shovels to clear firing slits through the rubble. With fuel gone, German panzers were reduced to immobile strongpoints, steel towers in a city of ruins. At night, Soviet sappers crept up under the cover of darkness, pressing magnetic anti-tank grenades to the armor and slipping away before the explosions ripped them apart. By morning, all that remained was scorched metal, blackened vision slits, and the lingering stench of burnt flesh. By December, as the Volga began to freeze, hunger and cold reached new depths. Veterans once decorated for their actions in France were now slicing strips of leather from their boots, boiling them with coal dust to make a greasy, foul-smelling soup. Soviet soldiers tore tar paper roofing from their shelters, burning it for warmth and choking on the toxic fumes. Radios in forward went silent, their aerials blasted apart by artillery or snapping in the frost. Orders were scribbled on grease-stained scraps of paper and carried by runners who often vanished in the chaos. Whole units fought for days without knowing what was happening 2 streets away. Then came November 19th. Operation Uranus slammed shut around the 6th Army. Soviet armored columns rolled across the snow-covered steppe north and south of the city, smashing through Romanian lines and converging at Kalash. Inside Stalingrad, the effect was immediate. The 88mm guns that had thundered in support fell silent. Artillery ceased. No more barges crossed the Volga. The men began wasting away, their bodies shrinking to 40 or 50 kilos. Helmets became bowls for melting snow. Coats turned into stiff shells blackened with grease. Ammunition was rationed to the point where a man fired only when the enemy was so close the muzzle flash scorched the wall. Some patrols ate raw horse meat. Others raided abandoned cellars, mixing sawdust with industrial oil to fill their stomachs, and died of dysentery before they could be evacuated. On the Soviet side, the suffering was no less brutal. Losses were staggering. Brigades were patched with half-trained replacements carrying rifles whose bolts sometimes wouldn't close. Political officers gave stirring speeches in the frontline trenches, but the shadow of the NKVD patrols, ready to shoot deserters, was as real as the threat of a German MG-42. Every meter forward cost dozens of lives. The order was unambiguous: keep the Germans pinned in the rubble until they suffocated. In January 1943, the Germans launched one last push toward the Volga, hoping to link up with air-dropped supplies. Planes dropped containers from 1,500 meters, but many landed in Soviet positions or vanished into the snow. The men who emerged from their dugouts were wrapped in blankets instead of greatcoats, their lips cracked, their eyes dull with exhaustion. They attacked in small groups, and after every assault, the survivors staggered back, dragging comrades whose hands or feet had been blasted away. No one cried. There were no tears left. The rats thrived, gorging themselves on corpses regardless of the uniform. Men hunted them and roasted them over makeshift wire fires. The meat stank like refuse, but it was food. Water was rationed to a single jug per man, sometimes melted snow mixed with grit that scraped the throat on the way down. Letters home piled up unwritten or undelivered. Some men glued family photographs inside their coats with axle grease so they would not lose them when they fell. By the end of January, the fighting was reduced to scattered shots. The city was a graveyard of rubble and twisted beams creaking in the wind. Snow blanketed the squares, broken only by the distant thud of shells or the whine of shrapnel. In the central square, a handful of surviving Germans, filthy, soot-streaked, out of ammunition, surrendered to a Soviet patrol. They handed over their weapons like useless sticks. One man held out a paper wrapper containing 2 mouldy biscuits, offering them to his captors with a mix of shame and plea. There were no words, only the crunch of boots on frozen snow as they were marched away toward the Volga, a river now running thick with mud, blood, and despair. After Stalingrad, the Eastern Front congealed into hundreds of kilometers of improvised trenches gouged into scorched wheat fields, the ruins of villages, and ridgelines strewn with unburied bones. German offensives were no longer possible, and retreat was unthinkable. The infantry of the Heer were ordered to hold every position as if the ground behind them was the edge of a cliff. So they dug, always digging, in the rain, in the snow, under fire. This was not the regimented trench warfare of the Great War. There were no neat maps, no fixed sectors. The lines shifted every day. A hill taken at dawn might be lost by nightfall. A patch of forest could be a fortress one week and a killing ground the next. The trenches themselves were little more than shallow pits scratched into the earth with rusty entrenching tools or even bayonets. No drainage, no overhead cover. In spring, the mud swallowed boots whole. Men stood ankle-deep in freezing muck for days at a time until the first signs of trench foot appeared, skin turning black, toes dropping away on their own. There were no proper field kits or medical staff. Orderlies cut away dead flesh with pocket knives while the wounded bit down on a stick. Rations were meagre, 1 loaf of bread for 6 men, onion soup so thin it tasted only of rainwater, and salted meat with a stench that turned the stomach. When the stores ran out, they scavenged from civilians, from dead comrades, or from the enemy. Coats, boots, gloves, all were stolen when needed. The camaraderie of 1941 had rotted away in the endless churn of mud and blood. The nights were worse. The cold bit like a living thing, making it impossible to sleep more than a half hour without risking frostbite. Guard shifts were relentless. Any movement beyond the trench lip meant exposure to a sniper's bullet. Soviet marksmen hid in tree trunks or among broken rafters, sometimes shooting a man in the gut to make him scream, then killing those who came to help. The soldiers called it bait fire. Most days began in silence until the shells came, sometimes a single round, sometimes a dozen, sometimes more. The earth would erupt, filling the air with dust and splinters. Men pressed themselves against the trench walls, helmets clamped over their heads, praying they wouldn't be next. If lucky, death was instant. If not, it was minutes of bleeding in the mud before the end. Soviet attacks came in waves, lines of men sprinting across open ground under the whine of MG-42 fire. The first ranks fell, but more followed, stepping over the dead. Those who reached the trenches brought the fight to knives, bayonets, rifle butts, and shovels. The ground turned into a slurry of mud and blood, littered with cartridge belts, torn limbs, and unexploded grenades. When it was over, those still breathing dragged the wounded away and returned to their spades, shoring the parapets with timber, sandbags, and sometimes corpses. The stench was suffocating, but no one complained. Death had become part of the terrain. On both sides, loudspeakers barked orders or promises. Soviet commissars promised vodka, medals, and leave. German officers shouted commands, few obeyed for anything other than fear. The idea of victory had faded. What remained was endurance. One more day, one more attack repelled. In some sectors, artillery had fallen silent for good. The guns were gone, the ammunition expended. Everyone knew that if the line broke, they would die where they stood. Some men stitched their names into their coats, not for official records, but in the hope someone might send word home. Water was collected in tin cans, foul with ash, dirt, even rat urine, and still drunk. Dysentery killed more men than bullets. Lice thrived in collars and seams. Skin split, hands rotted with fungus. Uniforms became a second skin of filth and dried blood. Within this misery, a quieter war played out. The sniper's war, a shadow battle where one heartbeat out of rhythm could mean death. German marksman Bruno Sutkus kept a meticulous log of every confirmed kill, not as a boast, but as a ledger of survival. Each day began with a crawl over frozen ground, rifle wrapped in rags to hide any glint, searching for a firing position among shattered masonry or tree roots. A single shot, perhaps two, aimed at an officer or gunner, then the slow, painful withdrawal, erasing every trace of movement. But the Soviets had their own masters. Vasily Zaitsev, famed in the rubble of Stalingrad, could detect the faint shift of light in an empty window or the crunch of a single boot on gravel. He trained dozens of snipers and turned the city's ruins into a vast killing field. The Germans sent their own experts, such as Major Koenig, to hunt him, a duel that passed into legend. Others, like Ivan Sidorenko, tallied hundreds of kills and trained hundreds more. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, nicknamed Lady Death, claimed over 300 before being wounded and sent abroad as a Soviet symbol. Hunters from Siberia, like Semyon Nomokonov, carved a notch into their rifle stocks for each enemy killed. Surviving encounters where the enemy assumed no one could still be alive. For both sides, the rules were the same. The first mistake would be the last. At 20 degrees below zero, a breath could betray a position. Many covered their mouths with frozen cloth to hide the vapor. Metal burned bare skin, so some cut away the fingertip of their glove for trigger control. Others urinated on a frozen bolt to free it before the enemy spotted them. Hours passed, staring through glass, reducing the world to a scope's circle, waiting for the single instant to kill or be killed. Inside the scope, the world was silent. Outside, the pulse drummed in the wrist. When the shot broke, the target fell like a marionette with its strings cut. Often, the shooter never heard a scream. The report of the rifle drowned everything. Only the sight remained. A body collapsing into the dirt, and that cold rush in the chest, like plunging a hand into ice water, the sudden certainty of having erased every one of that man's tomorrows. At night, those moments returned unbidden. A face framed perfectly in the crosshairs, the blossoming red at the center, the image frozen like a slide that could never be filed away. Insomnia was built from those pictures. Both armies devised tricks to hunt these hidden killers. German troops fixed officers' caps to mannequins and hoisted them above the parapet to draw Soviet fire. The Russians stuffed hats with straw and let them peek over their own lines, then traced the bullet's path to pinpoint the sniper's nest. Once a location was suspected, they answered with heavy mortars or Katyusha rockets, hoping to smash the tree or bunker flat. If no movement followed, someone would crawl forward to check, and often found nothing but a shattered scope and a dark splash where a man's head had been. Logistics were as much an enemy as the opposing marksman. A sniper's trade demanded precision, the right ammunition, a scope without scratches, a rifle zeroed to perfection. But on the Eastern Front, the supply chain was a frayed thread. Convoys were shattered by air raids or sank into the endless mire of the Rasputitsa. Boxes meant for the front arrived by accident in quiet sectors, while men under fire went without. Bruno Sutkus sometimes fired captured Yugoslav rounds when German stockpiles ran dry. Across the lines, Vasily Zaitsev used salvaged German rifles when his own were fouled by cement dust in Stalingrad's ruins. Fame, when it came, was a double-edged prize. Each confirmed kill added to the bounty the enemy placed on a sniper's head. German propaganda named its most lethal marksmen in bulletins to boost morale, awarding medals like the Iron Cross, but it was also a public notice to the Soviets of exactly who to hunt. Sutkus was christened the Wolf of Finka in the papers. Soviet loudspeakers promised that this wolf would be strung up by his own rifle. It wasn't empty boasting. When a famous sniper was killed, Soviet operators would read out his service record over the wire to prove that even ghosts bled. Women were not rare in this shadow war. Pavlichenko was the most famous, but thousands of Soviet women shouldered rifles, some painting flowers on their scopes. The delicate squeeze of the trigger was likened to the touch of sewing, just enough pressure for a clean stitch. Entire battalions had female sharpshooters, lauded in propaganda as mothers defending the motherland. In reality, the only thing that mattered in the trenches was a bullet's arc through an eye socket at 300 meters. Over time, sniper warfare grew both more brutal and more mechanical. Veterans developed invisible scars, a permanent tremor in the hands, the need to sit with their backs to a wall, flinching at the snap of a twig. Many could never again hunt or fire for sport. The scope became a curse. They saw the world through a ring of glass, even in peace. Streets, fields, even a child's face, all unconsciously assessed as a potential target. Those who survived often became instructors, drilling recruits to divide distance by 6, to control their breath, to steady the shot. The lessons were delivered like multiplication tables, exact, unemotional. But at night, the same men woke, gasping, reliving the fall of a silhouette they had once fixed in their sights. Those who didn't meet their end to a rival's bullet were crushed by artillery, consumed by gangrene, or smothered by the strange, empty silence of peace. A sniper's trade was by nature a pact with silence. And when the sniping stopped, another roar took its place, the metallic thunder of tank battles rolling over the Eastern Front. When the Panzers and T-34s met, the air thickened into a choking mix of cordite smoke, steel screams, and the grind of armor being torn apart. The roar of the Maybach engines was like the bellow of steel beasts, each one spitting fire and death. But inside the armor, life was no heroic tableau. It was cramped, stifling, deafening. The crew lived in a world of oil-soaked levers, shouted orders, the hammering thud of shells, and the constant fear that a Soviet flare would betray their position. The Totenkopf men inside their Tigers understood that even 60 tons of steel was no promise of survival. They had learned that Red Army anti-tank guns lurked in the strangest places, hidden in barns, under heaps of rubble, or beneath snow-dusted tree lines. An ambush could erupt from the crest of a low hill, or the shadow of a forest, and a well-aimed salvo at close range could punch through even the thickest plate. Before contact, the commander would inspect the load, armor-piercing for enemy tanks, high explosive for infantry and fieldworks, incendiary shells for anything that had to burn. The loader knew the sequence by heart. The first jolt of battle often came without warning, a shudder through the hull, the metallic scream of the tracks biting hard, and the voice in the radio spitting a warning that was already too late. Soviet machines, T-34s, IS-2s, were no relics. They were fast, hard-hitting, and everywhere. When a formation of them appeared through the snow haze or dust clouds, the Germans knew they could not win by standing still. They had to outflank, maneuver, wait for the perfect shot. Sometimes they got it, sometimes they didn't. Inside, the tank was a moving coffin. The air was thick with cordite and the sweat of 5 men sealed in steel. Every shot rattled teeth and bones. The 88's recoil sent a shiver through the hull. The blast deafened, and the seconds that followed were filled with the distant echo of destruction. A perfect hit could turn a Soviet tank into a furnace. Its turret blasted skyward like a cork from a bottle. But a miss invited immediate retribution. The clang of an enemy round striking the armor was like the punch of a giant's fist. The commander barked new orders, the gunner slewed his sights, the loader rammed another round home, all in seconds. There was no time for prayer, only the next shot. Even a victory brought no cheer. For every T-34 destroyed, there were 10 more pressing forward. All it took was one to break through to shred an entire company's position. In the fields of Kursk or the frozen plains near Kharkov, the land became a graveyard of armor. Tanks burned where they stopped. Men stumbled from hatches wrapped in fire. Bodies were trapped between searing steel plates. Grenades and Molotovs rained into open turrets. Black smoke blotted out the sun. When ordered to bail out, it was often under fire, leaping from the hull of a moving tank, hitting the ground hard, sprinting through bursts of machine gun fire while their own vehicle became a pyre behind them. And sometimes there was no movement at all. The tracks sank into mud like beached whales, waiting for the Soviet gunners to finish the job, or skidded helplessly down an icy slope until a shell split the beast in two. In those moments, strategy and ideology meant nothing. There was only the will to fire before being hit, to keep low, to stop the next round from finding the hatch. The loader's palms blistered from the shell casings. His eyes were bloodshot from powder fumes. His ears rang from the ceaseless engine growl. And still, no one left their post, because outside the armor was certain death, and inside it was only a matter of time. The radio crackled endlessly with news of losses, shifting lines, and desperate orders. A commander might have seconds to decide whether to charge, to flank, or to sacrifice a tank to shield the others. The men knew they were not knights of steel. They were moving targets. What did not burn under enemy fire might explode from heat buildup or be abandoned when fuel ran dry. Tank battles were a dance of steel and smoke, where fortune turned in moments. Sometimes the panzers advanced as an unbroken wall, crushing Soviet trenches beneath their tracks. Other times they found themselves surrounded, swarmed by enemy infantry with anti-tank rifles, magnetic mines, and petrol bombs. In those seconds, the roar of the engines became the trapped crew's last lament. If the armor was breached, their deaths would be unseen, charred at the gunner's seat or crushed between the tracks. No burial, no medal, only another line in a casualty report and a replacement tank sent forward to meet the same fate. With every withdrawal, tank crews knew the grim routine. If their machine became bogged down or immobilized, it had to be destroyed before it fell into Soviet hands. A burst from a blowtorch into the fuel tanks or a shaped charge under the hull, and they would watch the only thing that had shielded them from the outside world vanish in a pillar of fire. This was the reality of tank warfare in the East, an unending ordeal where steel offered no real sanctuary, only a few extra seconds of life. Battles followed the same ritual: aim, fire, endure, and eventually fall. The final roar was not from the Maybach engine, but from the sudden silence after the last detonation, because when armor failed, death came uninvited, and no man walked away unchanged. For the German infantry, the final months in the East bore no resemblance to the sweeping offensives of 1941. By late January 1945, most battalions were shadows of their former strength, often barely half their authorized numbers. Ammunition logs recorded stocks insufficient for even a single day's sustained fighting. Movement between towns was no longer part of an advance, but a desperate scramble to keep ahead of the Soviet tide. Each night march meant leaving behind wrecked vehicles, dead horses, and guns with no teams to haul them. New orders almost always had the same refrain: plug a breach, delay an enemy crossing, or hold a village for 24 hours to give the rest of the division time to fall back. The weather became a weapon in itself. February snowstorms and high winds rendered prolonged use of MG-42s nearly impossible. Ammunition belts froze solid, bolts jammed, and every muzzle flash betrayed the shooter's position to Soviet riflemen. Cardboard winter boots with worn felt linings were reinforced with straw and newspaper to ward off frostbite, but many men lost all feeling in their feet regardless. Still, they dug in each night, keeping their heads low to avoid revealing trench positions and rationing stick grenades because resupply came no longer by truck but by sled or by teams of exhausted men dragging carts. In East Prussia, the front was soon choked with civilian refugees streaming toward the Vistula. Soldiers joked bitterly that they were competing with these columns for the same narrow roads. Company officers often had to fire warning shots just to clear the way for a few surviving motorcycles carrying messages. But when Soviet artillery drew near, there was no separation. Soldiers and civilians packed together in cellars, indistinguishable in the dark, flinching alike at the shriek of incoming Katyusha rockets. Most engagements had become brief, violent exchanges. A Soviet platoon might push within 100 meters with automatics and anti-tank launchers, firing 2 or 3 rockets to blow open a gap. German rifle fire and the occasional machine gun answered back, but there were rarely enough anti-tank weapons to halt a T-34. When one appeared on the road, the fight was often over in minutes, with the company commander ordering a withdrawal before the unit was cut off. These hop-by-hop retreats splintered companies into platoons of barely a dozen men, regrouping in the next village under a new officer, a new unit designation, and the same gnawing sense of collapse. Illness took as many as bullets. Dysentery and typhoid spread through men drinking melted snow from shell holes. Medics rinsed rags in icy water to make bandages and sprinkled wounds with coarse industrial salt when nothing else was available. Morphine addiction was rampant. Ampules of synthetic opiates kept men marching until the supply ran out, and then the withdrawal hit them on the line itself. Accounts tell of comrades lashed to sleds to keep them from harming themselves in delirium. By mid-March, rumors of surrender mingled with calls for last-ditch resistance. Some officers distributed leaflets hinting at negotiations with the Western Allies. Others repeated fantastical radio reports of counterattacks that never came. Discipline, already fraying, snapped. Some soldiers buried their weapons and vanished into civilian clothes scavenged from abandoned farmhouses. Others stayed behind in small rear guards, covering the retreat of entire corps until their ammunition was gone, then trying to slip away through Soviet lines under cover of darkness. Surrender, when it came, was usually confused and brutal. A company might receive a ceasefire order at dawn, only to be shelled minutes later by Soviet batteries unaware or uninterested in the truce. Captures were often arranged on the spot. The German officer handed over his pistol. The men formed ranks and waited. The Soviets stripped them of weapons, watches, boots, and rucksacks before marching them east. Captivity began with forced marches of 20 to 30 kilometers a day, on little more than a ladle of thin porridge at dawn and watery soup at dusk. Those who collapsed were clubbed to their feet. Those who stayed down were left in the snow. Many drank from stagnant puddles, falling ill long before reaching the first camp. Rail depots brought no relief. Prisoners were herded into airless cattle cars, their only privacy a rag over a bucket in the corner. The smell of waste, unwashed bodies, and fear saturated the wood. Stops came only to remove corpses. The living were allowed a bucket of foul water before the doors slammed shut again. At the transit camps, processing was swift and merciless. Names were replaced with numbers, personal clothing often burned and replaced with oversized Soviet uniforms. Heads and beards were shaved with clippers that tore away skin, leaving raw wounds that festered under crude wrappings. Barracks were few. Many prisoners slept in open pits strung with barbed wire, huddled together for warmth. Food was black bread, barley water, and, if fortune smiled, a sliver of turnip. The first winter of captivity, 1945 to 46, claimed dozens each month to pneumonia and other respiratory diseases. The stoves in the barracks burned damp roots, giving off more smoke than heat. Blankets were patched with potato sack cloth and passed from man to man. A barter economy sprang up. soap for a buckle, half a cigarette for an extra spoon of soup. Ex-officers tried to impose order, keeping latrines clean and counting the sick and dead, but disease still ravaged the camp. Typhus outbreaks brought mass quarantines, hundreds penned in open-air enclosures, doused in quicklime and left to stand in freezing rain, their skin peeling away in sheets. Mass graves were marked only with numbered stakes. Inscribing a name was punished as ideological sabotage. Still, men kept lists in secret, hiding scraps of paper in boots or seams of clothing. Small acts of kindness came unexpectedly. Some guards risked punishment to smuggle bread inside kerosene cans. And in exchange, prisoners taught them to read numbers or mend watches. By 1947, the first repatriation transports began, not for valor, but for those too weak to work. The journey home was almost as harsh as the road to captivity, though less openly violent. Some reached the German border barefoot, wrapped in Soviet blankets, unsure if anyone waited for them. Others died within sight of their homeland. For those left behind, survival meant enduring yet another winter. They recorded the dead without flourish, speaking only of cold, hunger, diarrhea, and silence. There was no ending, only the question of whether the next wagon would bring food, or just more wind from the east. And that brings us to the end of this deep dive into the Eastern Front, one of the most brutal, unforgiving, and often overlooked arenas of the Second World War. At the start, I said this front was underrated. After everything we've just seen, do you agree? Was the true scale of this horror ever really understood in the West? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did anything in this documentary surprise you? Do you believe there's still much more we need to uncover about the Eastern Front? And one more thing, if any of you watching had family who fought here on either side, I'd be honored to hear their stories. These memories are fading fast, and it's only by sharing them that we keep history alive. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it this far, you are the reason I make these videos. Until next time, stay curious, stay respectful, and never forget what took place on the blood-soaked plains of the East.